Years later, Eliza Hart would understand that the poor cowboy everyone in Hollow Creek had mocked as useless had been quietly building a refuge for children the world had forgotten. But on the morning she stepped from the dusty stagecoach, she knew none of that. She only knew she had married a stranger named Caleb Roark because she needed a new beginning, and the entire town seemed convinced she had made the worst decision of her life. Welcome to Nordic Love Stories, where kindness can hide behind the quietest hearts, and love can begin in the most unexpected places. Eliza stood beside the stagecoach with one small leather case in her gloved hand, her faded brown traveling dress covered with road dust. Dozens of curious eyes followed her as she looked across Hollow Creek. Nobody approached. Nobody offered help. Then she saw him. Caleb stood beside the hitching rail, his old black hat pulled low, his boots worn from years of work, and his broad shoulders slightly bent as though he had learned to make himself smaller around people who never respected him. He was not handsome in the polished way of wealthy ranchers, but there was something steady in his face that made Eliza look twice. He simply nodded when she approached. "Eliza Hart?" he asked. "Yes. I'm Caleb." No smile, no grand welcome. Just two quiet words. An hour later, they were married inside the justice's tiny office. The ceremony was simple, witnessed only by a tired clerk who seemed more interested in his paperwork than their future. Caleb spoke his vows without hesitation, while Eliza kept her voice steady, even though her heart was full of uncertainty. She had not married him for romance. She had married him because she needed somewhere to belong. When the ceremony ended, Caleb picked up her case. "Come on," he said. Outside, an old wagon waited. During the journey to his ranch, Eliza tried several times to make conversation, but Caleb answered with only a few words. Yet she noticed how carefully he drove, slowing whenever the road became rough, so she would not be thrown against the wooden seat. When they finally reached the ranch, she expected a miserable shack. Instead, she found a modest but carefully maintained home surrounded by neatly stacked lumber, repaired tools, and strange half-built structures hidden beyond a ridge. Caleb carried her case inside. The house was clean but nearly empty. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn." Eliza stared at him. "Why?" He looked away. "You deserve privacy." It was the first kindness he had offered without being asked. The following mornings revealed more of his strange routine. Caleb left before sunrise and returned after dark carrying lumber, flour, blankets, nails, and sacks of food. Far too much for two people. He repaired the porch before Eliza could stumble on a loose board. He left extra water beside her stove. When the nights became cold, she discovered firewood stacked outside her door, but Caleb never mentioned any of it. Then one evening, Eliza heard a distant hammer striking wood beyond the ridge. Once, twice, again and again. She stepped onto the porch and listened. Caleb eventually appeared from the darkness, his shirt covered in sawdust and his hands rough from work. "What are you building?" she asked. He paused. "Just fixing something." Then he walked inside. But Eliza knew he was hiding something. And she had a feeling the secret behind that ridge would change everything she believed about the man she had married. Eliza tried to respect Caleb's silence, but curiosity grew stronger each day. The mysterious hammering continued whenever the sun disappeared, and every time she asked about it, Caleb gave her the same answer. "Nothing you need to worry about." But his actions told a different story. One cold morning, Caleb rode toward town to collect supplies. Eliza watched until he disappeared beyond the trail, then looked toward the ridge. She knew she should stay home. Instead, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and started walking. The climb was harder than she expected, but when she reached the top, she stopped completely. Below her stood several unfinished cabins arranged in neat rows. They were not random buildings. They had been planned carefully. Each cabin had windows, sturdy doors, and small porches. Eliza walked toward the nearest one and pushed open the door. Inside were little beds with folded blankets. She entered another cabin and found shelves filled with flour, canned food, and children's clothing. Then she discovered a third room with a rough wooden table and a small slate board. Her heart began pounding. This was not a ranch project. It was a home for children. Before she could understand more, she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Caleb rode toward her at full speed. He jumped from the saddle and stared at the open cabin. For the first time since their marriage, Eliza saw fear in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "Then tell me what this place is." Caleb looked toward the cabins. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he removed his hat and lowered his eyes. "Years ago, I found children living near a settlement that had burned down," he said quietly. "They had lost everything. Some had parents who never came back. Others had nobody." He explained that he had taken the first children to his ranch because leaving them behind felt impossible. Then more appeared. Every few months, another abandoned child arrived, and Caleb simply made room. He built beds, he bought food, he taught them how to work. But he had kept everything secret because he knew the people of Hollow Creek would call the children a burden. "So you built all this alone?" Eliza asked. Caleb nodded. "As much as I could." She looked at his worn hands and suddenly understood every late night, every wagon loaded with supplies, every mysterious trip into town. Then she asked the question that had quietly troubled her since their wedding. "Why did you marry me?" Caleb looked directly into her eyes. "Because I can't do this alone anymore." His answer carried no manipulation, no false romance. It was simply the truth. Eliza looked around at the unfinished cabins. The man everyone had called worthless had been spending every spare moment creating a safe place for children nobody else wanted. She stepped closer. "You should have told me." "Would you have stayed?" he asked. Eliza did not answer immediately. She thought about the empty house, his quiet kindness, the firewood he left outside her door, the repaired steps, and the way he always made sure she was safe without asking for anything in return. Then she looked back at the cabins. "I think," she whispered, "I already decided to stay." For the first time, Caleb's hard expression softened. But neither of them knew that the greatest test of their new life was about to arrive. The next morning, 3 children arrived at the ranch, carrying a single worn sack between them. 2 boys and a little girl stood beside Caleb's wagon, thin, exhausted, and frightened by everything around them. Caleb stepped down from the wagon, but suddenly seemed unsure of what to do. He had built cabins, repaired roofs, dug wells, and carried heavy lumber for years, but facing frightened children was different. Eliza understood immediately. She walked toward them slowly and knelt in the dirt so she was at their eye level. "You're safe here," she said gently. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." The little girl stared at her for several seconds before taking Eliza's offered hand. Caleb watched silently. Something changed in his face. That was the moment Eliza realized she had not simply married Caleb Roark. She had become part of the purpose that had kept him alive for years. From that day forward, the work belonged to both of them. Caleb built stronger cabins, repaired fences, dug a proper well, and expanded the kitchen. Eliza brought warmth into the rooms. She taught the children their letters, mended their clothes, prepared meals, and made sure every child had a clean bed and a place at the table. At night, Caleb often stood outside watching through the window as Eliza read stories to the children. Sometimes their eyes met and neither needed to speak. Their marriage had begun as an agreement between 2 strangers, but slowly, it became something neither had expected. One evening, Eliza found Caleb repairing a broken wooden toy for one of the boys. She smiled. "You know, you're becoming quite good at this." Caleb glanced at the toy. It was already almost fixed. Of course it was. He almost smiled. Months passed, and the hidden settlement began filling with life. Children laughed between the cabins. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Small boots lined the doorway. The sound of hammering was no longer lonely because it was mixed with voices, footsteps, and laughter. Eventually, the people of Hollow Creek discovered the truth. At first, they came expecting to see the failure they had always believed Caleb to be. Instead, they saw a thriving home where abandoned children were fed, taught, protected, and loved. The same townspeople who once whispered that Caleb was good for nothing now stood quietly outside the cabins, ashamed of how quickly they had judged him. Caleb never demanded an apology. He simply continued working. One spring morning, years after Eliza's arrival, she stood on the porch watching the children run across the green field. Caleb came to stand beside her. His hair had begun to gray, but his eyes were softer than the day they met. Eliza reached for his hand. "Do you remember what everyone said about you?" she asked. Caleb gave a quiet laugh. "I remember." She squeezed his fingers. "They were wrong." He looked at her. "About what?" Eliza smiled. "You were never the man nobody wanted." Caleb's eyes filled with emotion, but this time he did not turn away. He looked across the land they had built together at the cabins, the children, the garden, and the home that had once existed only in his imagination. Then he looked back at the woman who had entered his life expecting nothing but survival, and had given him something far greater: love, family, and a reason to stop carrying everything alone. Their story had begun with a lonely cowboy and a woman seeking refuge, but it ended with two wounded hearts creating a place where forgotten children finally belonged. Sometimes the world sees a poor man and assumes he has nothing to give. Sometimes the quietest person is carrying the biggest dream. And sometimes love does not arrive with flowers or promises. Sometimes it arrives with worn boots, rough hands, a repaired step, a warm blanket, and someone quietly saying, "You're safe here.